Okay, the grid. How did it grow big? How do we calculate cost with this? How do we use energy in California? So the first grid was very small, 1 mile in Manhattan in 1883. It was DC. It could be DC because it was small. So I want you to consider something as we go through this in the next week or 2 or 3. Is electricity a natural monopoly? Being that we have large infrastructure for distribution, should the government recognize that they should allow this to be a monopoly of one company as your utility, and they should govern it and manage it so that people are served? Or should we have competition? Should we be able to have 2 or 3 different wires that we can hook into? Or should the different utilities be required to share a common infrastructure? So by 1907, things had grown considerably. 1912, we had a 12,000 kilowatt or 12 megawatt facility. Interesting, they paid it off in 20 years, but the facility ran for 69 years. So please say cash cow. After you've paid off your mortgages, all you have to do is pay for the fuel and maintenance, which is very small, and you make a lot of money. Vertical integration. Companies could protect themselves if they own the infrastructure that mined the fuels, that generated the electricity, that transmitted the electricity long distances, and that distributed the electricity to the consumer. This is how companies protected themselves. So what we had was we had a great product with no market because no one owned commodities that consumed electricity. So there ensued an effort to create this market. Gold medallion was one of those, where we would advertise houses that consumed more electricity. We enlisted the help of famous movie stars such as Ronald Reagan to promote this better living through medallion homes. And yes, the consumption of electricity went up. Here is the year, and here is the consumption, but keep in mind, it's the log of the consumption. So this represents an exponential growth in electricity consumption. We start out in 1900 at 2.5 billion kilowatt hours. But in 18 years, it went up by a factor of 10. In 30 years, it went up by another factor of 10, a factor of 100. And over the next 40 years, went up by another factor of 10. Over the years, the maximum steam pressure and the maximum steam temperature increased considerably. Why is this important? We get better efficiency with higher steam temperature, with higher steam pressure. Let's take a look at this efficiency. Very interesting. The very first facilities got about 2% efficiency. And now we can look at the average power plant and the best power plant. I believe this is a Rankine cycle. About 33% efficiency for your average power plant, close to 40% efficiency for your best power plants. They got bigger, much larger turbines. And they continued to grow until about 1970. Here's the cover of a company report that predicts that the growth in size of turbines and generating units is going to continue. However, it did top out in the 1970s, and this is the actual growth after that. The largest facilities we get are on the order of 1.5 gigawatts. The cost of buying electricity dropped quickly. We see this in adjusted cents per kilowatt hour, or in 1986 cents. So it's adjusted for inflation. The very first electricity cost $3.20 per kilowatt hour, and has dropped to what we have today on the order of 15 cents per kilowatt hour. The cost of building a generation facility has also dropped, but more recently has increased in price somewhat. Again, we want to look at the diamonds here, which is the inflation-adjusted cost. And we can see that at present they're approximately $2 a watt. So it's a good number. $1 to $2 to $3 a watt is the cost of building the power plant. Nuclear is considerably more, but then you use less in fuel. This is added capacity as a function of the year. So in the 1970s, we added a huge amount of extra generation facilities. However, the transmission and distribution capacity and infrastructure increased at a slower level over time. Okay, so how do we use electricity? Here's a California load curve. And we can see as a function of time of day, this is midnight to midnight, and this is noon. This is our demand. The forecasted demand is in blue, and the red is the actual demand. So you can see that the California Independent Systems Operator can predict our use of electricity pretty well. It's also evident that we consume much more electricity in the daytime than in the early morning hours. And so to this argument, solar energy is not reliable for us because it only works in the day, we can see this is not a problem because this is when we have our peak need for electricity as well. So what are the numbers here? From 20 gigawatts to about 35 gigawatts, the average power use for California is on the order of 28 gigawatts of power, or recognizing that we have 35 million people in California, slightly less than a kilowatt per person is our average constant consumption rate of electricity. Up here at 43 gigawatts is our maximum production capacity. So we can't get more than this with all of our facilities running. That's not a problem unless it's summer. In summer, we have considerably more demand because of air conditioner load. And so you can see we could have a situation on a very hot afternoon where our demand is greater than our capacity to produce, and we'd have roving blackouts or brownouts, a crisis. Looking at the electricity demand for the year of 2000, we can see periodic oscillations for every week. Over the weekends, we consume less electricity. Over the summer, again, we see we consume more electricity because of pretty much equally commercial AC load and residential AC load. So who has to monitor this? The California Independent Systems Operator. We can go to their webpage, take a look at their mission statement. It's a nonprofit benefit corporation charged with operating the majority of California's high-voltage wholesaler power grid, balancing the demand for electricity with an equal supply of megawatts. The ISO is the impartial link between power plants and the utilities that serve more than 30 million customers. The ISO provides equal access to the grid for all qualified users and strategically plans the transmission needs of its vital infrastructure. This is important. Not only do we need to generate electricity, we have to make sure that we have the transmission capacity to get it to the consumer. This becomes an issue when we need to transmit too much electricity through a single line. And again, here we can see them forecasting on a given day. This is the present demand right here, and the peak forecast. This is the forecasted demand, and this is the actual demand that they measure. So how is the California ISO going to operate? What they know is they're always going to need 25 gigawatts. So if you own a power generation facility that is among the cheapest, 25 gigawatts in the state, you're going to be on all the time. Now, if yours is more expensive, you may be up here where you have to turn off every weekend. If you're very expensive, you may only be turned on when we need 40 gigawatts of power. How do we graph this? Let's take a look. Here we graph the power demand as a function of the number of hours that we need that in the year. There are only 8,760 hours in a year, so the x-axis could be thought of as the capacity factor. This is what we need 100% of the time. This is what we need 10% of the time. So 18 gigawatts is what the state needs constantly. So the electrical facilities that supply the cheapest 18 gigawatts are constantly running. But the state only needs 30 gigawatts about 20% of the time. So these more expensive facilities have a smaller capacity factor and will only be running 20% of the time. But more importantly, there are some facilities that are only going to be used 2% of the time when we have peak demand in the afternoon in the summer. And so what does this do to cost? Well, the cost of producing electricity, if you're a facility, you would think, oh, the dollars per kilowatt hour that we need to charge are our total costs divided by the total amount of electricity that we generate. The total cost can be divided into two categories. The mortgage payments that you have to pay the bank to pay off the loan that you took out to build the facility. This is called your capital cost, and the fuel cost that you have to pay in order to run the facility. So we can look at this as a fixed cost. You're going to have to pay this no matter how much you run the facility, and a variable cost that depends on how much you run the facility, or the capacity factor. And so the key is, if you have a large capacity factor and are running the facility all the time, this is much greater than the fixed cost. And so if you cut back on your capacity factor, it doesn't change much because you have it in the numerator and the denominator. However, when you have a very small capacity factor, the fixed cost becomes much more than this variable cost. And you find yourself dividing a fixed cost by a number that gets closer and closer to zero, and the cost to produce electricity skyrockets. So what does this do to cost? So again, we look at the electrical consumption versus the capacity factor, the percentage of time we need that electrical consumption. And here we have the cost to generate electricity at that capacity factor. And what you can see is the cost does not change much with capacity factor as long as the capacity factor is pretty high. But when you get to very low capacity factors, the 1% of time that we need 42 gigawatts of electricity, that electricity is going to cost you more than $1 per kilowatt hour, as opposed to the 15 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, this issue of the cost of peak electricity becomes very important when we study the California energy crisis. So lastly, how do we get our electricity in the United States and in California? We can look at coal, 50% for the United States, 20% for California. Natural gas, 17% for the United States, 50% for California. Nuclear, 21% versus 15%. Renewable electricity, which must include large hydro, is for California renewables and large hydro, about equal split, 10%, 10%. So we talked about the growth of the United States electrical grid, increase in size and capacity, vertical integration, improvement in efficiency with pressure, temperature, and size, with a decrease in cost. And we looked at how we manage the California energy curve. How do we manage the California energy demand with supply side management, that we always provide everyone with the electricity that they demand, and how that affects the cost of electricity. Thank you.